Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report podcast. I'm your host, Vago Muradian. Our podcast is brought to you by Bell. Since 1935, Bell has been redefining flight. Learn more about its pioneering spirit at bellflight.com. More than 85,000 Americans have died of the coronavirus, as another 3 million applied for unemployment insurance this week, bringing the total unemployed since mid-March to more than 36 million people. Tens of millions more may have simply dropped out of the workforce. This news as Democrats press a $3 trillion package in the House that Republicans say is dead on arrival. Joining us now to discuss the week in Washington are Dr. Gordon Adams of the Quincy Institute, Michael Herson of American Defense International, one of the top defense lobbying firms in Washington, former Pentagon Comptroller Dr. Dov Zakheim, and Ilan Berman of the American Foreign Policy Council. Guys, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, Vago.
Thank you for having me back.
Thanks, Vago.
Great to be back.
Michael, start us off, as you've been starting us off over the last couple of weeks. Democrats want to pass a $3 trillion stimulus package. The president and Senate Republicans have said that that idea is dead on arrival. So this is Washington, so it means it's somewhere between $1 trillion and $3 trillion. Generally, we have a tendency in this town of sort of splitting the difference. Walk us through where we are and what we should expect and what that calendar looks like. Because as these unemployment figures mount, and God forbid, if there is another surge in the virus, as is expected, as more people are just out and about, it's going to carry some economic penalties as well.
Okay, well, thank you. Let me read a sentence to you from an email that the Republican Whip's office sent out today, which gives you an idea of where we are. It says, tomorrow, the House will convene at 9 a.m. for debate on the proxy voting scheme and Pelosi's Socialist Wish List Act. So first...
so you mean there's a foundation for negotiation here?
Exactly. So we've been talking every week about the breakdown in partisanship, and continues to get worse. So, you know, the proxy voting and the rules change that they're going to vote on tomorrow is a big deal, because it actually will help the wheels of Congress turn more effectively, because the House has been unable to figure out how to get in safely, and not only move these bills, but move, you know, the FY21 defense authorization and defense appropriations bill. So tomorrow they're going to vote on remote and virtual hearings, which will include remote markups and remote depositions. Now, they're not going to vote on how to do that, just going to vote on giving them the ability to do that. And that will give the chairman of the Rules Committee, Congressman McGovern, the ability to decide how that's all going to work. He's going to come up with the guidance and set that in. Then they're also going to vote on proxy voting, which will allow one lawmaker could vote for up to 10 different members. So it'll allow a lot of members not to be able to come back to Washington when they are voting on bills. So, but the big news tomorrow will be the new stimulus package, which was initially dubbed CARES 2 and now is being called the HEROES Act by the Democrats. And it's only 1,815 pages long and only $3 trillion, which has caused some consternation even among the Democrats. There are some moderate Democrats that are not in favor of the bill, and there are a lot of progressives that are causing the Democratic leadership some headache about the bill. And they actually sent a letter to leadership asking for the consideration of the bill to be postponed until next week. And they have, I know, Pelosi would never bring a bill to the floor that she knew she couldn't win. So I think that she's got the progressives in line. 22 amendments were filed to the bill, 9 alone by Ocasio-Cortez, but all 9 of Ocasio-Cortez's amendments have been withdrawn. So it's very clear that behind the scenes, they have worked something out. Now, the bill does a lot of things. It extends unemployment benefits, it extends a second round of direct cash payments, it increases funding for state and local governments, provides more assistance for those who rely on food stamps, provides more money for coronavirus testing, worker protections, increased paid and family sick leave. It increases more funding for the U.S. Postal Service, changes our voting system to allow for vote by mail. It also has controversial provisions in there like hazard pay, almost $200 billion for people they can sit on the front lines. So people work at the grocery stores, people deliver packages, they want to give them extra money. It does include some things that can be defined as infrastructure, really focusing more on IT modernization, emergency benefit for broadband services, Also looks at low-income household drinking water. And there's a lot of tax changes in the bill as well. It looks at extending the tax credit to give employers breaks for keeping workers on the payroll. It would suspend the cap on state and local tax, the SALT deduction that was very controversial in Trump's first term. And then, some folks are unhappy that it does that they believe are non-COVID related things. I mean, this collection of hate crime data in the bill, safe banking for marijuana dispensaries. There's $50 million in there for environmental justice grants. But notably, there is no money for defense procurement. However, there are some things for the Defense Department in the bill. I mean, the defense community pushed hard for what the Section 3610 of the CARES Act last time, which dealt with federal contracting authority. But that provision was very poorly drafted and was not only being applied in not in an even way, but also we weren't sure what the start date was. Was the start date January 31st, or was the start date in March when the bill was passed? So this bill actually gives the defense contractors more certainty, which tells them exactly when this provision takes effect and directs the OMB on how to apply this evenly across the board. It also expands Defense Production Act to increase production of critical medical supplies. And the bill includes several provisions for federal contractors that would allow teleworking and require the Trump administration to issue government-wide guidance on implementation of reimbursement to companies. It also will ensure that contractors are not penalized for adverse performance ratings due to the COVID-19 disruptions. But, it was what Adam Smith had said earlier on, that they were not going to be looking at a Pentagon stimulus. Now, as you mentioned, this bill is dead on arrival, in the Senate. So what's the Senate going to want to do, and what's the White House going to do? And the Republicans in the White House and the Senate are still taking the wait and see approach, see how the last CARES package money is spent and implemented. The DOD, from what I understand, Esper has directed his folks to put together a package in case defense is part of the next stimulus package. But I wouldn't be optimistic on that because OMB has been cool to that idea. And Mitch McConnell's been cool to that idea. McConnell's drawn a red line saying he wants some liability protections, and the White House has still been very vague as to what they want. So I don't see this package being seriously considered until sometime in late June.
Does what happened to Senator Burr, obviously FBI seized his telephone. Dianne Feinstein's husband, if I'm correct, is also under investigation, and Kelly Loeffler from Georgia, whose husband was, I think, the New York Stock Exchange president, was under investigation as well. Obviously, allegations of insider trading. Does that dynamic change anything up on the Hill?
I don't think it does. I think that as far as these bills will continue to move, whether the investigations continue or not, it seems like somebody's always being investigated in Congress. But, I think that these investigations also take a very long time. We've seen several congressmen, several senators get investigated over the years, and these things could drag on for years. The only thing that upsets the apple cart is if one of these folks decided to resign. Senator Burr, being from North Carolina, Republican, there is a Democratic governor there. So if Burr were to resign over this, it would change the makeup of the Senate because the Democrats would pick up another seat there. Loeffler's race is very competitive in Georgia. Georgia's starting to become a little purple. She's got a competitive primary there, and Trump's numbers are not very good in Georgia. So those things have impact, but more in the long term, not in the short term.
Gordon, give us your sense on how this dynamic is going to unfold, where we end up in terms of a package, and then Dov, I want to get your sense as well on Pentagon impacts as well before we have a little bit of a broader conversation on kind of personnel changes that we may need to expect.
I do think that some kind of package is going to move forward. Michael's probably right about the pacing on that, though I've heard rumors of an earlier vote in the Senate on the House bill. May or may not be true. What's striking about it in terms of the subject matter of our podcast is that there is so little with respect to defense in every one of these bills. Not huge amounts of money, not huge amount of pressure to put things in for defense, although the department would certainly like to have it. I think that tells us something, and maybe not what we think initially. Not that the defense is not seen as important in the context of the larger stimulus bills that are being pushed through, but it suggests to me that defense is probably okay with respect to its top line as requested. that is seen by the Hill, and Adam Smith has suggested this is more than an adequate amount of money for the department to be able to get through the year. So I don't expect defense to be a big player in the budgetary politics this year, not on the addition side through supplement, certainly, and probably not in the sort of base budget and a supplemental side that already was sent up with the base budget. It is the foreshadowing, I think, for the next budget round that things are going to be on the table. And there, what's really critical, and that is true throughout, what we're seeing here is that it is the broader argument, discussion, debate, legislating around the federal budget, broadly put, that is having an impact on the defense top line. It's not strategy, it's not requirements. It is, as it has been 2 or 3 times since the mid-1980s, but broader budgetary politics. And I think those are likely to become more punishing for defense, in part because each of these additional stimulus supplemental bills is adding to the federal deficit, is adding to the interest costs on the federal debt, and is adding to what I fully expect to see as a revival sometime summer, fall, of a part of the Republican Party that argues, okay, now we've done so much, we've got to worry about the federal deficit. So you'll see a revival of something that the Republican Party in the Congress hasn't seemed to care very much about for the last few years, and that is deficit politics. When you get into deficit politics and you have a Democratic House and possibly a Democratic Senate, you can't make any deals here unless domestic is in the bargain. That's the disastrous politics from the respect to the Defense Department, because then anything that's up or goes down has to be done in tandem with what's being done on the domestic side of the budget. So there's political pressure that is going to emerge when the bigger budgetary argument and deficits are being argued about, that is going to add to, I think, the pressures over the next year or two on the defense top line.
Dov, you've sat in the Pentagon during, well, I mean, it was an upside, right? I mean, at least it started with budgetary pressure and skipping a generation when you started in the first term of the Bush administration. But then obviously 9/11 happened and all bets were off, even though you were one of the people who was always articulating for fiscal responsibility, even then. How do you see all of this playing out? Because we've talked about defense impacts on the show, and we're agreed a long time ago that there were going to be defense impacts. What's your sense on where we are and the immediate term about where we're going?
Well, in the immediate term, I think I'm pretty much where Gordon is. I do think that the defense request is the ceiling. Adam Smith may still push for some degree of reduction. And frankly, given what we're speculating that there will be some additional stimulus package measured in 1 trillion or more, that's going to create huge pressures to do something about defense, not only next year, but maybe even this year. The other thing about next year, and here I'm actually more pessimistic even than Gordon, if that's possible, is that I'm not sure that when domestic and defense are weighed against each other, that it'll be 50-50 or 1 for 1. I think that domestic will command a lot more. There will be a sense that we've just got to do a lot more to get our economy back on its own feet. And there will be much less sympathy for defense. Here, I'm totally in agreement with Gordon on that. And so I see the pressures being unrelenting. In fact, were interest rates to go up, which I don't think they will, but were they to go up, there would be even more pressure because that would just add to the national debt. There is an impact on strategy, and that is the following, in my view, which is these kinds of pressures on the defense budget are going to make it much more difficult for us to continue to have the kind of global posture we've had. We've already said in the National Defense Strategy that Russia and China are the most important. That's not going to go away. It's really China and Russia. Russia's the junior partner in this threat assessment, obviously. But even if President Trump is reelected, he has always been a little skeptical, both about defense spending. Remember, he originally wasn't so keen on it, and about getting out of the Middle East. And it seems to me that we may actually have to prioritize, and there may not be a lot of sympathy for sticking around in the Middle East as long as we have until now, and giving it the same degree of priority. So there may well be strategic implications. Again, it won't be strategy driving the budgets; it'll be budgets driving the strategy. But I think that well could happen.
I want to talk a little bit more about the international situation, and Dov and Ilan bring you into the conversation about Afghanistan and the tragedy that unfolded there, and frankly, the tragedy that is U.S. negotiations to try to end this. But let me go back to Michael for a second. David Cutrone, the White House's man, is now over at the Pentagon. And we discussed that a little bit last week, that he was going over there to ensure loyalty to the president, and some heads apparently are already rolling. Michael, tell us a little bit about what's happened, but more broadly, what we can expect to happen over the coming weeks.
Well, I think it was about 2 weeks ago, we talked about how Michael Cutrone was sent over to the Pentagon to try and root out the people over at DOD who are not loyal to the Trump administration. So today, Jen Santos, who's one of Ellen Lord's deputies, and also was in charge of overseeing the implementation of the Defense Production Act, was abruptly let go.
She's the manufacturing and industrial base policy person at the Pentagon, and the Defense Production Act falls under her office.
Right. So she was abruptly let go today, which caused quite a stir, inside the Beltway today. I've seen a lot of email traffic from different defense contractors as to why did this happen. We've seen some mainstream media, CNN covered it earlier today and said, she did nothing wrong. Why was she let go? So a lot of it really is speculation whether she's going to be the fall person for how the DPA has been implemented, or was she not considered a Trump loyalist privately because she's considered more of a free trader. But I think this is just the first of several people that will be rooted out.
I mean, the one thing to say in Jen's support, I mean, she was nothing but supportive of the administration's position in any of the public settings. I think she took over last June, if I recall correctly. And ultimately, the Defense Production Act implementation has to come from the White House. And if memory serves correctly, the president has invoked it only 2 times. I mean, Ellen Lord, the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment, has been saying that they're ready and waiting for a demand signal from the White House on this. And I believe the president executed it on pork, as well as make Ford and General Motors work on ventilators, which both companies had said they were going to do anyway, right? So, I mean, can we expect...
I think...
Go ahead.
Well, look, I mean, I agree with you. Jen is a friend of mine. I know Jen for a long time, and I think everything you said is spot on. But we also have seen this administration, and specifically our commander-in-chief, loves to play the blame game. We saw he blamed the WHO for what went wrong with our coronavirus response and decided to cut off funding. So I think this is she's unfortunately was at the wrong place at the wrong time.
Dov, do you expect any additional blowback from this on Pentagon leaders? And more importantly, what impact does that have on the team that Dr. Esper has there, which by all accounts, for a lot of the key jobs, is actually a pretty competent team?
Well, it is a competent team, and it's a team that works pretty well together. Look, my biggest worry is about Ellen Lord. Ellen is highly respected inside the building, inside industry, around town. She doesn't need this job. She took it because she's a patriot. I mean, in the real sense of the term, not in the sense that's thrown around politically. I worry that she might decide that this is ridiculous, that she doesn't want to be assigned deputies that because of White House whims, and that she might walk. And that would really be very bad. We have major issues with the supply chain for the defense industrial base. We have labor issues for the defense industrial base. We have budgetary issues. And we need somebody who really knows the base and knows how to manage the system. And I worry terribly if we get some kind of acting in Ellen's place. So yeah, there could be blowback, and it could be really troublesome.
Let's move to Afghanistan. And Ilan, I'd like you to start us off there. Obviously, an incredible tragedy where there was the massacre in the maternity ward in Kabul. That's raised a lot of questions about what's next, as the United States has sort of been negotiating a one-track process with the Taliban directly. What are the implications of this, and what's sort of the next step in the United States trying to extricate itself from Afghanistan as part of its sort of shift to greater focus on Russia and China?
Well, I think it's that last part that's really the most important, because we are putting the cart before the horse. The administration has made a policy decision to pull out of Afghanistan, to reduce our footprint there and refocus on other things. And the peace process, the truce, so-called truce that has come about with the Taliban is a product of that. But it's actually not a product that's based upon a measurable change in Taliban behavior. The Afghan National Security Advisor said as much. He tweeted out earlier today talking about the fact that what we're actually seeing now is a level of violence that's commensurate with other seasons of the same composition, right? So what we're actually not seeing is a new beginning. We're seeing business as usual on the part of the Taliban. The real question here is whether or not this actually creates any change in the Trump administration's behavior. My sense is, unfortunately, that this really isn't going to lead to a reconsideration of this policy. The Trump administration has, so to speak, baked the cake. It has made clear that it wants an exit from Afghanistan. And as a result, the Taliban understand, I think, very well that they can behave as badly as they want to without any real consequences.
Dov, you know a lot of the senior, or almost all of the senior Afghan leaderships, as well as the folks on the U.S. side who are doing the negotiating. What's your sense about where we are and where we're going?
Well, Zal Khalilzad was basically given, it looks like, an order to make a deal to get us out. And he made the deal and will probably get out. But the Taliban, they understand that that's the objective. And in fact, since we actually signed this agreement in Doha, the level of Taliban attacks has actually gone up. And it's looking more and more like the Vietnam War, where we basically decided we were getting out. And we negotiated a Paris deal that didn't hold up, and we got out. The difference between that and what we've done today is that, at least in Paris, we brought in the South Vietnamese. Here, we have not brought in the Ghani administration. It's been one-sided, but that seems to be the modus operandi of this administration, because if you look at the so-called deal of the century, which is the Middle East deal that Jared Kushner put together, he didn't talk to the Palestinians at all. It's supposed to be between Israel and Palestine, but he didn't talk to them. Again, it was one-sided. And if you look at our successes, and we've had tremendous successes at negotiating deals when we were the third party of the peacemaker. Teddy Roosevelt wins the Nobel Peace Prize for sorting out Japan and Russia in 1905. And Dick Holbrooke does it in the 90s. And George Mitchell does it in Ireland after God knows how many years of troubles. But they brought everybody in. Mitchell actually brought in not just the British and Irish governments, but literally eight different groupings from Northern Ireland. That's how you do it. We're not doing it that way. So we're just digging an even deeper hole than we've already dug ourselves.
Well, and then one of the other big challenges of doing it this way is this plays into the fear of every nation we get involved in, that we're eventually going to sell them down the pike because we want to leave on our schedule, not the schedule of the crisis. And the bitterness that existed between us and the South Vietnamese was very palpable, that we, basically cut them adrift. Gordon, you study the history of these conflicts as well. What's at stake here ultimately when the United States is regarded as an unreliable partner at the culmination of a 20-year-long
Let
war?
me slightly dissent from what has been said. In this sense, I think Dov is right to compare this to Vietnam, but I think part of that comparison has to be that the United States, as we did in Vietnam, has been attempting to prop up and sustain a government that is simply does not hold the country and does not command popular support in the country and is largely corrupt. That's problem number one. Problem number two, that's also quite similar in some respects, is that the adversary here, the Taliban, has a depth in the rear across a border that was also true for the relationship between North Vietnam and South Vietnam. And point number three is that almost everything that we have done has been, let's say, practically unrewarded by success. The governance strategy has not succeeded. The economic strategy has not succeeded. John Sopko, the Special Inspector General for Afghani Reconstruction, has been dispositive over 8 or 10 years now in pointing out the dismal failure of most American policy efforts to prop up, create a governable country, to create a political system, to create a working economy. It's not a doable do-out in the end. So the question of reliability becomes, I think, not only quite secondary. I'm always reminded here of the amazing example of Charles de Gaulle and Algeria. That at some point, it was very clear to President de Gaulle in France that France had an unsustainable relationship with the Algerians and an unsustainable occupation of Algeria, a country that was practically a department of France at the time, and simply announced that France was leaving Algeria. Sometimes a leader gets rewarded for actually stating the reality here. And while I don't hold a brief for the Trump administration in almost any regard, and I think their Afghanistan policy has been as sort of diverse and unpredictable as possible, there is a thread here that I think, Vaga, you pointed to, and that is that he came in thinking that the days of American sustained involvement in a country like Afghanistan were numbered. He wanted it to be numbered. I won't say he had an in-depth view of the consequences of that, but I actually question whether the United States, in making, if you could make a clear and sustainable decision that this was done, that it doesn't necessarily affect the reliability of the United States and the rest of the world. What affects that reliability is the unpredictability, non-alliance behavior of the administration with respect to almost everybody else that we have a relationship with. That has led to a real sense that the Americans are unreliable.
And I should point out that the Taliban, if I recall correctly, has denied involvement in the killing, I think, of 18 mothers in that maternity ward. Michael, let me go to you, and we've got 2 other quick things that we need to talk about, but I want to get your sense on where lawmakers are for their support for Afghanistan at this point. There has been a tendency by some to be supportive of the troops, but there are not that many troops that are there now. The number is, I think, down to about 10,000 or below 10,000. Is there any support for Afghanistan, or is that support effectively evaporated to go back to that? Once there were too many stories about South Vietnamese corruption is when Congress sort of pulled the plug on South Vietnam, and then it was all over. This is, history doesn't repeat itself, but it's starting to rhyme a little bit. Where are lawmakers on their support for Afghanistan at this point?
Well, I think support is evaporating. Chairman Smith has made clear that he would like to get out of Afghanistan. And I think people are growing weary on Capitol Hill. It's become our longest war. It's cost us a lot of money, and at a time when the deficit hawks are going to come back, which I think Gordon made that point earlier, and I think he's spot on. I think Dov's point on strategic implications for the Middle East is spot on, because I think that will apply to the entire region, including Afghanistan. That we are going to see much less of an American presence there, and then I think beyond that, we've got to figure out too how we maintain our credibility after pulling out not only Afghanistan but also what happened in Syria, And then, the implications for the industry I work in with the arms sales, because weapons sales have been held up to that region. And there are a lot of folks in the region that say, hey, look, we can buy from China very easily. And they'll sell us more sophisticated weapon systems with no strings attached. And that has also major strategic implications for the U.S. But I think there are very few Republicans left that want to cross Trump on Afghanistan. There are a few like Liz Cheney and others, but I think the momentum is against them.
Ilan, I want to bring you in the conversation. Mike Pompeo has made his first trip. There were a lot of other opportunities to travel, whether it was for NATO meetings or anything else, but he's decided to go to Israel. There's a bubble around him where everybody's got to get tested. Everybody's got to wear masks. They've got to stay far away from him. What are the reasons for this trip? What was it? Why was it so important for the Secretary of State to visit Israel? Obviously, news reports are talking about discussing Iran, annexation of the West Bank, talking to the new government before it takes effect. But what was the bigger reason to make a trip like this?
Right. Well, I think it was all these things. It was Israeli-Palestinian peace and Iran and the new unity government. But I think, for my money, the sleeper issue here that is worth watching is the Israeli-Chinese relationship. This is something that, we've talked about on the podcast in the past, but it's really something that hasn't gotten a lot of top shelf attention. But it's a huge issue because over the last decade, in the service of its global image as the startup nation, the Israelis have really thrown open the doors for Chinese foreign investment. Not only Chinese, right, international foreign investment, but the Chinese have really taken advantage of the opening, and they're now poised to become the single largest national investor in the state of Israel. And a lot of those investments, right, they're essentially investing in everything, but a significant portion of Chinese foreign direct investment is being directed at industries that at the high-tech sector and at companies and software and processes and technologies that are effectively dual use and can be used for military applications as well. And it's something that the Trump administration, even though they're very, very supportive of the Israeli government, has grown increasingly concerned about. And this is not the first time the issue has come up. Back when he was National Security Advisor, John Bolton famously raised it during his negotiations with Netanyahu. But it's something that very clearly the White House is still concerned about, even though the Israelis have tried, at least superficially, to mollify Washington.
Well, but and the issue is the Haifa port, which is a very, very important base that American forces use, and obviously the U.S. Navy uses in the Mediterranean. That's being run by a Chinese management company. And then the Israeli response is, well, these deals do get reviewed, pass through a security review. It's just that the dollar value is so high that it's functionally useless in some respects.
Well, it's worse than that. If I can,
Sure.
It's worse than that because Israel, as a confidence building measure with the White House, last fall set up their own version of the CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, essentially a governmental oversight body to investigate investments for national security ramifications in Israel. But, and here's the big but, that institution, as of right now, has something like a $6 trillion cutout for the high-tech sector, which means that effectively the core concern that the Trump administration has about the vulnerability of the Israeli high-tech sector is still very much actual.
And thanks for correcting me, because I was getting it wrong. And this is the second time, or the latest time, that Israel is getting in trouble for doing business with China. The Bush administration cracked down extraordinarily hard on the Israeli administration, and that was carried on by the Obama administration as well, for transferring sensitive technology to China as well, that led to a whole bunch of changes that Israel was supposed to adopt. Dov, what's the resolution to this challenge? Because Israel's attitude is, I've had dinner with senior Israeli officials who said, look, you are the superpower, and eventually China will be the superpower, and we just have to stay on the right side of whoever is the superpower in the world. What's the resolution to this sort of yin and yang that's been tugging at this critically important relationship?
First of all, it's not simple. I agree with you. Second of all, this has been going on since at least the 90s that I'm aware of, maybe the late 80s. And each time the Israelis say they're going to be good boys, and each time something else pops up. We had an issue with Patriot, for instance, years and years ago. Resolution is tough, but I think that there was a hidden message that Pompeo brought with him, because Pompeo also said, don't move so quickly with annexation. It's got to be in sync with what we're working on right now. And I just sense that what he was really saying was, you go ahead with China, we're not going to support you on annexation. And of course, Bibi then cannot go ahead with it, and it'll be, a tremendous defeat for him, et cetera, et cetera. The Israelis have to figure out how to thread the needle. They know how to do it. I mean, clearly, Elon just pointed out, you don't have cutouts for technology. You basically review any kind of Chinese investment, whether it's $1 or $1 billion. There are things they can do, and there will be things that they will allow the Chinese to do, but just not to the extent that it's being done now. Remember also that for President Trump, it's critical to be able to be showing that he's bashing everybody to come into line to deal with the Chinese. All you have to do are look at his emails and his texts and things coming out of the RNC that are branding Biden as a panda hugger. So he clearly, in order to get people's attention away from the pandemic, in order to demonstrate that he's being tough on China, he's got to demonstrate that he can't look the other way under any circumstances. And I think that was the message that Pompeo had to bring with him.
Unfortunately, we've got to end it there, but I want to very quickly give Michael no more than 30 seconds. Do the Republican wins in California and in Wisconsin mean anything to the broader political dynamic and the future of the race later this year? Because in both of these districts, Hillary Clinton polled very, very well, and they were both areas where Democrats took back seats in 2018.
True, but personally, I don't think so. I think each race had their own individual dynamics, especially the one in California where the member had to resign in disgrace, and the Republicans had a very, very solid candidate, and that district was Republican prior to for the 2018 election. And as I say every week, it's a lifetime between now and November. I think just the overall dynamic now does not fit well for Republicans.
And I know I'm breaking my rule because I said last question to Michael, but Dov, I've got to give you a couple of seconds as well, because we did talk about annexation, and you wrote a very thoughtful piece in The Hill that's gotten a lot of attention. Talk to us a little bit about the case you're making.
My argument was that annexation will alienate friends of Israel. It'll probably alienate the Gulf states that have been working less and less surreptitiously with Israel. It's going to make it very difficult for them to work with Israel. It will give the Europeans an excuse to push for the so-called BDS, boycott, disinvest, and sanctions. It may be possible, if there's a Democratic administration, that the United States will not veto something like that in Security Council. Annexation, in other words, could rebound in such a negative way that to create Israel as a kind of international pariah, something it hasn't been since the 1970s.
Yeah, and I remember at that time there were such great Israeli statesmen, and the number one, Abba Eban and others, whose whole drive was to make sure that no matter what happens on the international scene, Israel is always seen as either the victim or in the right in any of the actions it was taking, as opposed to being perceived at all as a villain.
And the irony of it is that just not doing anything, they've got a problem with what to do with the settlers. The settlers are there. It's not going to change anything on the ground. It's purely sort of a kind of cosmetic action, but it's of a kind much more than even moving the embassy to Jerusalem that's going to inflame the Arab world and, frankly, inflame Europe and many of Israel's newfound friends.
Guys, thanks so much for joining us. We really, really appreciate it, and look forward to having you back on again soon. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Vago.
And stay well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks for joining us. Please follow our daily interviews with top government, military, industry, and thought leaders at Defense and Aerospace Report, and subscribe to our weekly newsletter. Follow us on Twitter at DefAero Report. That's at DEFAERO Report. Like us on Facebook at Defense and Aerospace Report, and check us out on LinkedIn. Check out our weekly cyber report sponsored by Northrop Grumman and our broader Navy coverage that's sponsored by Fincantieri Marinette Marine. Thanks again to Bell for their generous sponsorship, and we'll see you again tomorrow.